This was my day of revelation. My splendid son and I went on a holiday when he was about 14. And he went to look at museums, and I went to look at cathedrals up and down the country to see why they didn't fall down. And as we came out of Coventry Cathedral, there was this wonderful day, and there was this crane right in front. And it suddenly occurred to me that this crane was a foot upside down. And that it only remained stable and didn't fall down because the end of the jib and the string that he was lifting things with, the support column on which it was built, and the counter jib remained in line. If one of them became angled, then the thing would have fallen down. So that looked like a forefoot. That was the heel, and that was the tibia. And the light happened to be shining, sunshine, on this rope, the wire connecting the two, the jib and the counter jib. And that was the plantar aponeurosis. So if you put it upside down, that was a foot in plantar flexion. And the sling spring mechanism was really supporting the structure as a cantilever type structure. So it occurred to me that if the foot was going to remain stable as it changed posture, it would need to be balanced. That the main points of pressure, forefoot, the line of force down through the talus, the line of force down through the talus, and the support at the back, the tendo Achilles, would have to remain in line. And I started to think about it. So if you had the tendo Achilles and the pressure force, point of ground reaction force, the centre at the front, and you drew a line, then the centre of body mass line through the talus would have to coincide with that line. And I look back to Ambegsh's diagrams, and lo and behold, if you put a marker in the middle of the talus, there he was. He was suggesting that in fact this could be a possibility. So the concept developed that the foot was a balanced lever mechanism. And that seemed to fit. I mean, the heel did seem to be behind the centre of pressure at the front of the foot as far as one could judge. We took photographs, did pedobarographs to see where the centre of pressure was, noted how it changed from the medial side to the lateral side as the foot supinated and pronated. And the foot never fell down. We took x-rays and did the outlines, drew lines through what we considered to be the centre of the pressure, the middle of the talus, and the attachment of the tendo Achilles at the back, and it seemed to fit. The three support areas seemed to be in line, just like the crane. Those are the three positions. Pronated, the middle one is neutral, and the supinated. And you can see how the pattern of ground contact changes and underneath the metatarsals, and the movement of the centre of pressure as the foot pronates and supinates. again with the foot plantigrade. And we do the little lines again, where we thought the tender Achilles would be, and where this line would cross the forefoot in relationship to the pedobarograph pattern. And it seemed to be all right. We got quite excited. I stole this apparatus from the hospital, and these are 3 sets of lines which are in line at the front and at the back, as it were. So that rod is in line with that one, and I could put members of my family inside this, and I could estimate where the centre of pressure was underneath the forefoot, and have a rod directed towards the centre of the ankle, and then see where the corresponding rod at the back pointed to, whether it went directly to the heel. So here was a plantigrade foot, opposite the rod going to the middle of the ankle, and lo and behold, wasn't it nice, the rod at the back pointed towards the middle of the tender Achilles. Very crude, but I couldn't think of anything else to do. This is high heel elevation over a transverse metatarsal axis. So the centre of pressure would be towards the first and second space, and the rods again coincided. The back rod pointed directly to the back of the heel. And this was elevation over the lateral part of the foot, a lateral oblique metatarsal axis. And the rods again said, yes, it looks as though it could be a balanced lever, in that there was 3 points. The middle of the talus, the tender Achilles, and the centre of pressure at the front were in line. So we developed this hypothesis that the centre of pressure, the foot could be adapted, it could change its position, so that in any position of supination to full pronation, it could be put in a position where the balance line was there, with the centre of pressure in the front, the line of force down through the talus, and the support at the back from the tender Achilles or heel pad would be in line. And if that was so, then the foot would be stable, and it could function as a balanced cantilever. This was just to look from the back and see what the heel was doing when we balanced over the forefoot, single foot balance, and balanced over the forefoot, and we put the pedobarograph underneath. So this was heel elevation, and that seemed to be absolutely perfectly in line. Now obviously as the foot supinates and pronates, it will slew a little bit and be oblique, and therefore this won't fit. But this seemed to be encouraging, that this was remaining in line as we balanced on one forefoot. Now it has supinated too far, and so really it was an oblique, I think, balance line, but I can't prove it. And then we came back again, and we were once more in line. So the hypothesis wasn't exploded. It seemed to be a reasonable supposition that this was a possibility. And if you looked at the positions where they were in line, there were quite a lot of them. Now, getting out the skeleton and bearing in mind the various measurements that are available from the stereophotogrammetric studies and Ambagscher and Professor Lundberg's, we put the foot into neutral and a supinated position and a pronated position, and all our calculated angles and positions between the various bones would fit with the available information. And we then compared the pedobarograph that one would expect for early heel elevation from these positions. And for the transverse metatarsal axis, you can see there that the whole of the forefoot is weight-bearing just about. And then we put the centres of pressure from the various pedobarographs that we estimated would be appropriate for these positions. The centres of the talus and where the tender Achilles was attached. And really, the skeleton as such seemed to substantiate the idea that the foot movements at the three joints could accommodate the idea that the foot was a balanced lever, or could be a balanced lever. And if you look then at the so-called rocker direction, the area of the foot that's in contact with the ground, and the metatarsal axis, this again seemed to be reasonable and fit with the pedobarographs. So I'm suggesting that there is the probability that the coordinated intertarsal movements can allow the foot to be a balanced cantilever structure as its posture alters. Active control of these lateral swing movements is provided by the peronei and tibialis posterior. And our studies have tended to confirm that these actions occur when the foot is weight-bearing. The coordinated lateral swing and rotatory movements occur from the midfoot level and are controlled by these tendons, muscles. And when you look at them, they're remarkably symmetrical, as it were. They each have an insertion into a peripheral bone. Tibialis posterior is into the navicular. Peroneus brevis is into the base of the fifth metatarsal. Peroneus longus goes across to the base of the first metatarsal and the medial cuboid, medial cuneiform. And of course, the deep part of of tibialis posterior is inserted into practically all the tarsal bones. The sad thing is that many anatomy books don't mention the fact that tibialis posterior has a deep part. And in many surgical texts it is not mentioned, and when tibialis posterior is reconstructed, the reattachment is usually only mentioned to be to the inferior part of the navicular. I suggest to you that our investigation, we've pulled on these tendons, and the deep part of tibialis posterior is winding round the head of the talus. When you pull on it, it pushes the head of the talus laterally, and it pulls the navicular medially. And the opposite occurs on the peroneal from the peronei. These are reciprocating antagonists. And this, I suggest, explains the control of the midfoot. If the centre of body mass is falling medially, then the talus will be tilted into pronation, the pink area. If the talus pronates, it makes the structure of the foot underneath it supinate and laterally angulate at the transverse tarsal joint. They are inevitable. The peronei are then stretched as the centre of body mass falls medially, and it then contracts and it moves the foot medially, and it's got to move it further than the direct line from underneath the centre of body mass. And once it's done that, then the centre of body mass will stop falling to the left. And usually, of course, it's overactive. The centre of body mass then starts to fall to the right. The talus then supinates. It makes the underlying foot pronate. Tibialis posterior is stretched, and it will then contract, and away we go. And so we go backwards and forwards. I suggest to you that this is the mechanism for lateral balance. Tibialis posterior and the peronei are just alternating, reciprocal, arranged, adjusting mechanisms. It's capable of providing continuous and coordinated postural adjustment for lateral balance while you're running, walking, or balancing on one foot. She lost it, nearly. It resembles the juggler balancing a vertical structure. If it falls to the right, he's got to move the base so that it's further than the top of the pole, and then it stops falling to the right, but the pole then starts to fall to the left. And so you go on. I had hours of happy fun. But that, I think, is the basic mechanism. It has to be, as far as I'm concerned. And it's the lateral swing movement is controlled by tibialis posterior and the peronei. For many years, it's said in some texts that tibialis anterior and peroneus longus are antagonists, and that tibialis posterior and peroneus brevis are a pair of antagonists. Of those four muscles, only tibialis posterior is a ventrally supplied retractor. All the others are originally protractors. Tibialis posterior and the peronei have dorsal nerve root origins. So I suggest it is more correct that when you look at antagonists, tibialis anterior and the toe extensors are dorsiflexors, and they're antagonists to gastrocnemius and the toe flexors. The peronei are the antagonists of tibialis posterior. And on this, one can explain the balance mechanisms of the foot. The stretch reflex is what controls the balance. Now, we mentioned before the transverse and the oblique metatarsal rocker, as it were the axis of which the foot undergoes heel elevation. And this is related, we think, to the balance line. Now, I just want to compare a toddler and an adult, because the toddler has a wide-based gait, and the adult tends to walk with her feet close together. And the toddler really doesn't correct until about the age of 6, and then they start to walk more normally like an adult, as we would say. This is a 2-year-old. And I just want you to compare her with her mother. Isn't that lovely? And you will note that the foot is internally rotated. And this is the classic thing, as I've noticed, or think anyway, that toddlers tend to in-toe. And when it comes to their metatarsal axis of rotation, it's transverse. Now then, watch it again, and this time look at the ankle in relationship to the forefoot. And the ankle comes up absolutely straight, behind the foot. There's no lateral swing. So if they are able to put weight from one leg to the other, they need a wide-based gait. They don't have this mechanism of being able to shift the ankle laterally during the propulsive phase of the walking cycle. Here is mum. Now watch the ankle. As the foot flattens, it goes inwards. And then there comes a stage where the centre of body mass is moving over this foot, and tibialis posterior says that's enough. The foot is flat enough, and it starts to supinate it, and it's helped by an oblique metatarsal axis so that the ankle moves laterally and helps to propel the centre of body mass towards the other side. Just to repeat, there we are, medial movement and then lateral movement. And you can expect the ground reaction forces to be moving and propelling the centre of body mass to the other side. So midfoot supination and lateral movement of the ankle during the propulsive stages is influenced by the obliquity of the metatarsal brake ankle. The windlass mechanism of the great toe, as you heel elevate, the windlass mechanism will automatically make the midfoot supinate. And then we've got the adjustment of tibialis posterior and the peronei. I suggest that all three mechanisms contribute to foot posture control in the adult, and that they are required for the normal narrow-based gait that most of us have. Here's another small child with a lovely wide-based gait. And a foot that's straight in front. And heel elevation occurs very late. Here's a narrow-based gait. And if you watch the top, you can see the pelvis moving over the left leg. And it gets so far. That's the maximum lateral pelvic movement shortly after mid-stance. And now heel elevation, and it pushing the direction of forces pushes the pelvis to the other side. But the narrowness of the gait is extraordinary. So now let's just look briefly at ground reaction forces of the walking cycle. The two peaks, as you know, one shortly after heel strike and one during mid-propulsive phase. And the dip in the middle is due to the fact that at that stage of the cycle, mid-stance, the knee flexes, and so you're effectively falling through space, and therefore the weight on the pedobarograph or your ground reaction force measurement apparatus is reduced. We know that the ground reaction forces are backwards during the first half of the stance phase, and they're backwards towards the centre of body mass during the first half of the stance phase, and then during the second half of the stance phase, they are coming forwards to propel you, just like the acceptance of load and elevation and propulsion that you see in most hopping animals. The forces in the coronal plane are almost entirely medial. There's a very short space of time after heel strike when the lateral medial forces are actually in a lateral direction. There. And for the rest of the time, there is medially directed forces. So this is looking at a right foot, as it were, from the front, and those are the vector forces in the coronal plane in time going from left to right. That's the initial heel strike forces which are directed laterally, and from then onwards there are medially directed forces pushing the body mass medially towards the other leg. In the first half of the cycle, the forces are acting as a brake and then become propelling towards the other side during the second half. If you relate these forces to the pedobarograph, going from left to right, from heel strike to toe off, you will see that the maximum lateral displacement of the centre of force from the ground is at mid-stance. And then towards your right, the forces go off towards the big toe. I walked in a very straight line through the snow, and you can see that that was a pretty good narrow-based gait. And I fabricated the forces for 2 steps, and they're all going medially, so that when one is standing on the right leg, the forces are propelling the centre of body mass towards the other leg. And somehow or other, the foot adjusts its posture so that these forces are almost entirely medially directed, and we don't fall over laterally. I don't know whether this is related, the forces are related to the tilt of the talus or any axes in the foot. and this needs investigating. It would be absolutely wonderful to know what stimulates tibialis posterior and the peronei to adjust the posture of the foot so that it is in a position to throw our weight back towards the other side. In the top series you can see that the sagittal plane vectors change direction from going backwards to being forwards, in other words propulsive, at mid-cycle. There's no having good trying to propel yourself if the body mass is behind your centre of foot pressure. The coronal plane vectors are all directed medially after the initial heel contact, and I've tried to make their length appropriate to the position of the centre of body mass. In the second half of the stance phase, the body weight needs to be moved over to the other leg. And here, in 1889, Muybridge showed exactly that. The little line, dotted line, is on the centre of forefoot pressure. And the pelvis is seen to move from left to the left foot, towards the left, as the propulsive phase of the stance phase is progressing. To your left, the line goes through the middle of the pelvis, and by the time we get to the picture on the right, the pelvis has moved to the left, and the line, the foot line, goes through the hip or thereabouts. So these forces are at work as we walk and run. Just watch this. This is coming to top dead centre, and the centre of body mass is just above the foot. Going back, and can you see that the foot supinates very slightly? Yes? Do you see that stick move? And now it starts. So it's as though at this critical point, something stimulates tibialis posterior to say, I've got to supinate this foot so that it gets into a posture to throw the weight back to the other leg. That's a teleological argument, but something happens. And I suggest that it's stretching of tibialis posterior, and now it starts to work, and the foot supinates and the ankle moves laterally, and we propel ourselves to the other side. It needs investigating. Has anyone got any apparatus to do it? And you can see that the centre of body mass is coming over, and the force lines, perhaps. Tibialis posterior is stretched at this stage, and we just move the foot over a little bit, and now the propulsive forces send the centre of body mass over to the other side. All imaginary, but something has to happen to do this. So when one is walking or running and one is propelling oneself forwards, something has to make the centre of body mass move to the other side. The obliquity of the metatarsal break means that the foot supinates. The windlass mechanism of the great toe means that the foot must supinate with heel elevation. And tibialis posterior and the peronei are the great monitors and positioning experts. If the windlass mechanism is absent from the great toe, then supination of the midfoot is the responsibility of tibialis posterior, and it has to work very hard. And I suggest to you that when you think about people with hallux valgus, whose windlass mechanism of the great toe doesn't work, then added strain is put on tibialis posterior. And if you look at your cases of tibialis posterior rupture, I will bet you a penny that at least 90% of them have hallux valgus, and their great toe windlass mechanism is not helping the foot change its posture, to propel them forwards and to move the centre of body mass to the other side. All three mechanisms are required for normal balance, normal walking, and normal running. So I wish to suggest to you that the human foot has four main parts: toes, plantar pad, and aponeurosis. That there's a stable central forefoot segment, and behind that a calcaneus and a talus. That there is a plantar pad lying between the two layers of the aponeurosis, and this allows spread of the weight-bearing area of the forefoot when heel elevation occurs. That the transverse tie bar, the plantar plates, and the deep transverse metatarsal ligaments, and the plantar aponeurosis form a very important and unique supporting multi-segmental tie bar system. That the reversed windlass mechanism controls plantar flexion of the toes at the metatarsophalangeal joints. Gastrocnemius and the aponeurosis form a two-part sling-spring mechanism. That there is a central longitudinal foot structure of bowstream beam type. Central stable forefoot segment, the calcaneus and the talus. It's supported and controlled by three layers of plantar ligaments. There are ligament tensioning mechanisms. The windlass mechanisms for the plantar aponeurosis. The talar slide mechanism for the ligaments around the talocalcaneal navicular joint and the interosseous talocalcaneal. The lateral swing movements at the transverse tarsal joints enable the foot to function as a balanced cantilever. And I suggest that this enables the three main force lines to be in line, so that it really is a balanced structure, as though you're on a number of ice skate sections as the foot moves from pronation to supination. And the tib post and the peronei are essential for its control. I have to acknowledge some very grateful thanks for this clinical and perhaps you think eccentric ideas of how the foot works. And I'm very grateful to them, and I'm also very grateful to the help I've had from my good friend Bertel Romanus. So that's just the idea of how the foot works. And I think, yes, that, as it were, concludes the mechanistic side, and after that, if you're still interested, we can talk about the destructive side as to how the foot falls apart and how perhaps knowing how we think it works, these might be influenced.